your hands if you know who Shirley. Do we know who Shirley Chisholm is? We know who Shirley Chisholm is. First black woman to run for president on a major party ticket. First black woman to be elected to Congress. The organization is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to amplifying the voices of power of black women so that they can be better advocates on behalf of the communities that they serve. It's an honor to be named a Dole Fellow with the Dole Institute, an institute named for the Congressman Robert Dole. And during this discussion series, we're going to discuss everything that has taken place over the last 4 years or so that has shifted and changed politics for the better or worse, depending on where you sit. From protests to the pandemic, to social media, to black women, to presidents 45 and 46, I want to do a deep dive and bring about experts from all over the nation to talk about what has changed in politics, what's the matter with American politics, and what you can expect in 2020. So with that, just a little housekeeping. The Dole Institute, like a number of institutions, is looking to pave the way to be on the cutting edge of innovation as we challenge and try to push through the pandemic. And so these sessions will be hybrid. We typically have guests who are virtual panelists, but we have panelists in an audience in person. If you're joining us virtually, be sure to send your questions so that you can join the discussion at KU Questions. Dole Questions, D-O-L-E, questions at ku.edu. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and do an introduction of our panelists who are here today to talk about political identity today. What does it mean to have the different political identities that shape American politics and how that will shift? First and foremost, I'd love to introduce Mr. Randy Dunn, a Kansas City native. Randy is the executive director of the Missouri Democratic Party and is a former member of the Missouri House of Representatives, representing the 23rd District. He was elected in 2012 at the young, tender age of 29. And was reelected in 2014 and 2016, respectively. That means he did a good job. He got reelected. Randy previously served as a community affairs liaison for U.S. Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. Thank you for joining me today, Randy. I appreciate having your insight on this panel.
Absolutely, thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Ravi Perry, who is the chair and professor of political science at the Real HU, Howard University. Perry is the immediate past president of the Association for Ethnic Studies, and he was recently named 20 of under 40 shapers of the future worldwide by Encyclopedia Britannica, because that still exists for those of you who don't know. That's still there, and he was awarded by them. And in social activism and politics, Dr. Perry is the author and editor of 3 different books. Did you want to talk about your books and what they're about and what people can expect if they and when they buy them?
Sure. So I've written 3 books. My first book was on Black Mayors, White Majorities. It analyzes African-American mayors in Ohio and what they did in predominantly white cities for African-Americans. My second book was a test of that theory to see if it could work in larger cities and also with Latinos and Asian groups. And that book is 21st Century Urban Race Politics Representing Minorities as Universal Interest. And the theory was proven to have worked. And then my last book was a book published with my mother, The Little Rock Crisis, which analyzes the 1957 integration of Central High School, of course, which was made a national story by Kansas native Dwight D. Eisenhower. So glad to be here.
Thank you for taking the time to join us here in Kansas, all the way from Washington, D.C. We're excited to have your thoughts and your perspective. Last but certainly not least, we have Anoa Changa, organizer by nature, which is how I've come to know her, and a lawyer by trade. Don't get it twisted. She can organize and deal in legal issues just as effectively. Anoa has a deep history of working within the realms of advocacy and justice. Expanding on her experience as an attorney, Anoa has been a grassroots digital organizer, and strategic advisor to several organizations, including the Senator Sanders campaign in 2016, among a number of others. She came to work for PRISM, from the New Georgia Project. I don't know if you've heard of the New Georgia Project. They were responsible for flipping Georgia, one of the many organizations responsible for flipping Georgia. They're a nonpartisan nonprofit working to register and engage Georgia voters, which led to the big win in Georgia. And she served as their digital strategy and storytelling director. Prior to that, she held the position of city's electoral manager for Democracy for America. She is currently a writer for a number of national newspapers and outlets, including Essence, among others. She is my sister friend, and I'm so excited to have her here in Kansas today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
With that being said, thank you all for joining me for our discussion today, Political Identity Today. Again, if you're watching us virtually and want to join the discussion, be sure to send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. I think we're ready to get this party started, and we're going to start with Dr. Perry all the way from D.C. Give us some grounding and just base knowledge of how the American political party system came about, and what are some of the core tenets of the different political parties as we see them today? How did they get initiated, and how have they evolved over time? I know that's a meaty question, but I think that for most Americans, voters, and the like, we hear a number of terms that are used interchangeably to mean the same things. You think progressive, you think Democrat, you think, you hear these words and they get used interchangeably. So I really want to do some level setting. What are the main American political parties, and what is their historical start and initiation, and how did they become the parties that we see today?
Well, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a great way to start this conversation. The American political party system was not in existence when the country began in 1776 and when the Constitution was ratified in 1789. We certainly had opposing interests, which we called at the time groups known as Federalist and another group known as Anti-Federalist. If you wanted to fast forward hundreds of years, you might argue, although it's a really bad argument, but some people make this argument, that Federalists were more similar to Democrats of today and Anti-Federalists more similar to Republicans of today. It's a bad argument, and if you don't believe me, then take a political parties class or wherever you can find one to get a more in-depth understanding of that. We had multiple political parties throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Some cool names included like the Know Nothing Party, the Whigs, and one time Democrat-Republican was one party. And so there was not a consistent political party presence among any of the main elected officials throughout the early 1700s and 1800s. And then Andrew Jackson comes along, and he wins the presidency. And he opens up what we call the spoil system, where basically he said that the party system is no longer for elites only. It's for everyday folks as well. And that began the process of socializing all Americans to be engaged in the American party system. Fast forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s. By then, two parties had been solidified in the country, Republicans and Democrats. And they basically flipped their ideology in 1964. So there's a period called the Partisan Realignment, and that Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Baines Johnson election, what we had was a shift where Southerners who originally were many called Dixiecrats and members of the Democratic Party switched en masse and became members of the Republican Party. And it's clear to understand why this shift happened. It was solely because of civil rights. So, and it had a lot to do with the filibuster, which we can talk about how that dovetails with some things for today. But that's how we got the current modern party systems. In 1964, Democrats and Republicans became the parties that have the ideologies that they do today. And they pretty much have been in sync with those ideologies. And so You can be a Democrat or Republican, and you can be liberal or moderate or conservative and be a member of either party. And so the ideology that one ascribes to in terms of your belief system is not necessarily the membership of a party you may belong to. And in fact, most Americans actually do not identify with a political party, but they do identify with an ideology, and most of the ideology is actually moderate left. The challenge is not everyone, of course, votes. And so the execution of party ideals and ideas haven't always happened. And as we've seen in the 2016 election and others, many in the public criticize parties for not doing enough to get their candidates out to certain neighborhoods or what have you. And so today, obviously, we live in a very polarized context, and we still have these two main parties. And so we are a two-party system. We have had third parties before, third-party candidates for office, Ross Perot, obviously a famous one, Ralph Nader, famous one as well. Third parties have never gotten anywhere near possibly close to ever becoming president. But it is something that we can have in this country. And so the two-party system is not fixed, even though it may feel that way. But it's been extremely difficult in this country to have a third party that actually has been effective in terms of generating the mass mobilization it needs to be able to compete against Republicans and Democrats. One thing Republicans and Democrats agree on is that they don't want a third party.
Well, they may agree on the fact that they don't want a third party, but third parties continue to be developed and continue to exist, whether it's the Green Party or in New York and other states where you have the Working Families Party. Those parties continue to exist and thrive and attract voters and can tilt the scales in very important elections at the national level and sometimes at the local level. Expound on a couple of things for us, again, so that we can continue to level set. If you could, I'm going to go back to one of your comments earlier, talk a little bit more about that shift in party identity that happened during the civil rights era, because a lot of the arguments that you'll hear when talking to folks is, well, the Republican Party was once a party of black people and freeing slaves and the like. So talk about how that shift occurred and what that meant for the parties and what that means for voters in particular. But also, if you could talk about and differentiate the difference between party affiliation, identification, and ideology. What does it mean when I say I may be a Democrat, but I'm progressive? I may be a Democrat, but I'm moderate. And what does it mean to be an independent? Is that a legit third party? A number of people are identifying as independent. Is that a party? Is that an ideology? What is that?
Wow, so I appreciate all that. So I will start with the Partisan Realignment I mentioned in 1964. That was really the end of the multi-decade transition of the two parties. The first major kind of thing that happened is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected as a Democrat from New York right after the Depression. And we saw millions of poor people, mostly old folks, on the streets, homeless, et cetera, lost their jobs. It was a horrible time in American history. And so we had the president create what we call today a safety net, but the Social Security programs that basically everyone over the age of 65 pretty much relies on. So Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those major programs were all started under FDR. Because of that, a lot of African Americans and women got jobs and opportunity that they had not received before in prior administrations. So you began to see a whole bunch of black folks shift their allegiance to the Republicans. That was because Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican and freed some of the enslaved via the Emancipation Proclamation. And that shift of that allegiance for the Republicans, for African Americans belonging to the Republican Party, began in the early 1930s because they were attracted to FDR and to his wife, by the way, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course. And that transition really continued throughout the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, where you began to see civil rights issues, of course, in this country really hit a boiling point. And we saw both parties struggling with how to handle civil rights issues. To be fair, no party really wanted to initially, address civil rights challenges, and it was really much kind of a local state issue, and national politicians were really hesitant to do so, which is what made for example, what President Eisenhower did in Central High School in '57 so unique, because he took federal action, gave those 9 children the opportunity to enter school with the 101st Airborne National Guard there to, of course, tell the governor that his policies and his laws were null and void because federal government and the federal system that we have, federalism, supersedes state and local laws. So that transition to the Republican Party losing a lot of African American support and shifting to be the party that, under the presidency campaign of Barry Goldwater, was anti-civil rights. That was their party platform in 1964. And that solidified that transition for African Americans away from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. The 1960 election what began that transition, but it was really solidified in 1964 when Barry Goldwater ran an explicitly anti-civil rights campaign versus Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas, of course. The second question about ideology is such an interesting phenomenon. Yes, there are independents. There are about a third of what we consider the kind of electorate are independents, if not more. Independents tend to be people who may not have a party affiliation, may belong to a third party perhaps, or they may belong to the Democratic or Republican Party, but they don't have fixed partisan allegiances. So they don't vote the same way in every election, what we call a straight ticket. And so many of these folks tend to be women, which of course is the majority of the electorate anyway, but also tend to be folks who live outside of urban centers, in rural areas, in suburban areas. And we find that independents have an increasing role in American politics today. You can't find an election where independents are not referenced, particularly when it comes to a close election. We always say, oh, it's going to come down to those independents. And those are people who have a strong ideology of their own. And it's clear to say that independents are not moderates. They aren't pragmatists necessarily. It's the ideology of being not a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in our two-party system.
And in the campaign space, we would say they're undecideds. We don't know which way they'll lean.
Exactly.
But again, that's kind of the interchangeability of the terms that we use to identify folks who essentially don't identify as being a part of or aligning with all of the ideals of one of the major two-party tickets during the
and that's why you get people
season.
who identify as progressive, as liberal, as conservative, as moderate. And those are all different labels that can be attached to any partisan ID that you may have. So, for example, John McCain considered himself a liberal Republican, a moderate Republican, right? And you have people like Joe Manchin now who considers himself a moderate conservative Democrat. And so your ideology about how you see government working doesn't necessarily align exactly with a political party. And that can change. There's a spectrum of your ideological beliefs. And so like sexuality, it's a spectrum. It can flow, it can change, it can go back and forth. It's not something that's necessarily always fixed. On the liberal side of the equation, you tend to have centrists and moderates who often, I think, get horribly mischaracterized as people who want to kind of delay change. But I consider moderates more so as institutionalists. They tend to be individuals who argue that the systems of the American political process now can work, and we should try them in order to see how far they can work. Often they get accused of being conservative because the institutions, of course, move slowly. And if you want progressive, quick change, then the moderate centrist view is likely not the camp you will put yourself in. Then there's liberal and progressive on the further left side of that spectrum, and we could have conversation for hours about the differences between liberals and progressives. But progressives tend to be on the far left end of the spectrum, and liberals are individuals who really do associate themselves with the kind of classical liberal idea of American government in its most kind of basic form, in that we do have a system that works for people, and people should be the center of that. And liberal politics tend to follow that particular point of view. On the far right side, you've got moderates and conservatives, of course. Then you have people who identify on the far right, of course, as Republicans, but also they identify as what they consider themselves as, in some cases, extreme far right conservatives. And so there's, interestingly enough, not as much of a demarcation of ideology on the right as it is on the left, which is another reason why the parties have some of the challenges that they do. The Democratic Party is far more diverse in its ideological and its descriptive context, whereas the Republican Party, you have a few moderates and a few liberals, but the majority of the ideology does identify as conservative, and you could argue that the differences are important, because on the right, you only have kind of two demarcations of ideological difference, and on the left, you've got three, some cases four, and that's why you have some of the infighting that we see in Congress, and that's also why it's easier for Republicans often today to find agreement on things than it is for Democrats.
Well, with that being said, we have a progressive on the panel, at least two of us. I identify as a Democrat and as a Black progressive. We can get into that a little bit later. But Anoa, I would like to open the floor to you to kind of do some level setting on what progressivism is in your perspective and from what you've seen, as opposed to in juxtaposition to what Dr. Perry has laid out, and if you have historical context that you want to share, because progressivism feels like a political ideology that has risen to the top and to our awareness as of recently and as of late, but Congress has for a long time had progressives in office, and there's been a history of progressivism throughout this nation. And so I wanted to open the floor to you to speak to that. And don't let me put labels on you.
No, you're fine, you're fine. I was just joking with my kids before I came, as an independent that mostly caucuses with Democrats. And I found your description of independence actually really interesting. I first became an independent or unaffiliated voter when I was living in West Virginia. When I first started practicing law in West Virginia. And it's the party of Manchin, the Democratic Party in West Virginia, and I was done with the Democratic Party in West Virginia. I was not going to join the Republican Party, and when I learned that I could still participate in the electoral process but be considered unaffiliated, and I could still vote my conscience and still vote for who I wanted to, I was like, bet. I went straight over and changed my voter registration, and everyone around me was so scared. They were like, but what if you don't remember to pull the right ballot? What if this happens? Okay, I got to pay a little bit more closer attention, but I could still do what felt right for me, right? And I think what we've been seeing maybe transition over the last several years in particular is that we have more people who are really aware of how their participation isn't just this thing I need to check off because mom and dad or whomever, grandma, whoever say that I have to vote, that our participation actually matters for something, and my values are something that I can vote on and I can feel good about what I'm doing. But how do we do that, and how do we show up? And so I do appreciate the way we organize around parties and identity, because there is collective power when we come together to move and make action happen. I think also it's important for us to understand that we don't have to be so tied up in those labels when we're trying to decide what are the values that are in the best interests of our communities, right? I was a young parent. I had kids when I was in college. And so there are a lot of things that I value that are very important to me. Child care access, jobs, making sure families have assistance with, food and things of that nature, with, whether now what's the SNAP program now. I mean, there's so many different things, you know, making college affordable. My kids are in college now. Those are things that are, so my values end up aligning with voting, you know, primarily for Democratic candidates that are, you know, that's a part of their platform and stuff. When we think about what's happening at the local level, I think that independents and third-party candidates should be investing more if they really do have an interest in building that political wherewithal to then have those higher challenges. There should be a stronger investment at the local level in running local candidates. We actually saw in Philadelphia, I think it was in 2019, you mentioned the Working Families Party, Michelle. We saw the first independent get elected in Philadelphia, I forget in how many decades, but Kendra, who was a city councilwoman, was a Working Families Party candidate. Working Families Party is an independent party, but they tend to run their candidates on Democratic Party lines. In the state of New York, they have what's called hybrid party voting. So you can run as multiple different parties in addition to like your main party affiliation. But everywhere else that doesn't have that, because most places don't, Working Families Party candidates, you know, it tends to just operate as a political organization, and their candidates tend to run as Democrats. But in Philly, Kendra had the opportunity to run as an independent and did. And it was an interesting scenario because there was an open seat because something happened, there was no Democratic candidate. And so it was too late to file that way, so she ran as an independent and won. And so there was this real shift for people, like, wait a minute, I can vote for someone else who still has these values and issues that apply to me, but I'm not necessarily aligned party. Now, I'm not saying that we need to upend the parties and do away with all of it. I may be a progressive, I'm not a total anarchist about current government, but I do think what we've been seeing, what we call progressivism, and you know, Michelle, you and I have talked about this for many years, a lot of times, some of these labels, though, don't mean anything to the average working person, right? Like, we hear these things on MSNBC or CNN, but what does it mean? You know, what are the meat and potatoes, right? What are the bread and butter issues? Like, how does this factor in? Like, for those of you who are students, or if you have students, you have students of your own who are in school, I mean, what does it mean for the student loan interest rates that are going to come and get me when it's time for graduation, right? What does it mean for the job that I may or may not be able to even get after graduation, right? Like, how do these things impact me? That's what we're thinking about and looking for when we're talking to candidates and challenging people. So when we're talking about what is progressivism, I really do think that it's a set of ideals that really put, you know, the best hope forward for how can we better, you know, the lives for the greatest amount of people as quickly as possible. I do think that, and we were talking about this earlier as well, that about the level of realism or being a little bit pragmatic within that. And I think that might be the difference between, say, a Bernie Sanders and an Elizabeth Warren, for example, right? Like, you might have, you know, Bernie Sanders is like, let's just push it no matter what. It doesn't matter whether we get it through. We just need to stick to our guns, and this is what it is. And that's beautiful. And you have Elizabeth Warren like, yes, let's push it, but also let's see what's reasonable, what can we get done, right? And I do think that that is a tension. When you talk about the divisions on the left, that is a huge division I think we see amongst progressives. Which path is the best way to take? Like, do we just like throw it all to the wall, burn it all down no matter what? Or do we get what we can get because we can get that right now and then still work for more later? And I think that continues to be, you know, a strategic question for people about what matters. But when
Anoa,
go ahead.
Interrupt you. You've seen the same tension on the Republican side.
We see the same tension. I think you're right.
Former
Absolutely.
President Obama was elected to president in the emergence of the Tea Party, or even today
Absolutely.
with the emergence of former President Trump and the values that he has embedded in the Republican Party and the shifts that have occurred because of that.
I think ultimately what we see with these different battles in some of these niche spaces, we tend to have particular groups that are appeasing something else other than the rest of us. Is ultimately what I think, right? Because when we're thinking about what's really in the best interest of the collective good, it's often not these very niche arguments that are happening over point whatever percent of interest in this very small part or pool that the average person, it's not going to help me get bus fare to get to work, right? It's not going to help me make my house payment. It's not going to address the fact that we still have people who, despite, you know, jobs coming back, despite, you know, improvement in vaccination rates, despite some of the improvements we've had in the economy, it's not going to help those people who are still sitting outside, you know, unemployed or struggling because of the eviction crisis, which, even though it's not on the news, it's still very much happening. The other thing I would say, Michelle, is I think our media plays a really huge role in some of these divisions and breakdowns that we're seeing, and really isolating what makes, because I honestly, not being a Republican, not being in Republican spaces, I don't know how much of what we see projected to us about the rise of Trump Republicans is a true reflection of their side of the spectrum, right? Like I've had, again, living in West Virginia in law school and practicing, I've had Republican friends, libertarian friends, and I remember, this recent election cycle, like the look on people's faces in horror at some of the things that was happening because it didn't reflect what they felt their values were. But we have a media that is unfortunately chasing dollars, cents, clicks, viewership that puts a spotlight on these issues that may or may not actually be the real issues we're all facing, right? So you're right. These differences do exist on both sides, but to what extent that those are the issues and these differences, that I'm not actually sure. And like I said, I think the media, and I say this as a current member of the media, that I do think that we center, as an industry, it centers those divisions more at the expense of democracy itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even with that, you bring up a couple of really good points. And what I'm hearing from both you and Dr. Perry is that there is an alignment or an intersection of values and the values that a political party may tout or champion. Randy, if you could talk a little bit about and do a little more level setting on what are the values of the Democratic Party, what are the values that drive its voters, and then how has that shifted even in recent years with everything happening with presidential elections, COVID, so many things impacting how you go about your work.
Sure. And first I'll say I think the conversation that we've had up to this point has been really important to sort of illuminate, again, kind of where different people are along the spectrum, trying to provide some level of definition of these different terms, because different terms mean very different things for different people. Mm-hmm. For instance, people consider Joe Biden a moderate when in reality, his platform that he ran on is much more liberal and or progressive than the platform of President Obama, who is viewed as a liberal by most people.
So you view how they land on the spectrum, how candidates may land on the spectrum, not just by what they say, but their platform issues and maybe even how they vote. What are some of the criteria that you utilize to say, okay, so-and-so, this candidate, this voter is here in this space and on the spectrum?
I think, so I won't speak for how I define that. I think for how I see a lot of other people define it is oftentimes more in terms of how a candidate presents themselves, and not so much in terms of really what their actual platforms and or ideals are. And so that, again, can create a lot of confusion in terms of, again, is this person a moderate? Are they a liberal? Are they a progressive? Are they a Democrat or are they a Republican? Or what are they? As it relates to the Democratic Party, though, in terms of what we stand for, I will say, at the core, we stand for doing what is right for people and trying to impact change on the lives of people. We've heard, again, everything from ensuring that childcare is affordable, that everyone has access to affordable health care, to a high quality education. Those are some of the foundational core values of the Democratic Party. And then in addition to that, we believe in, again, everybody being able to be involved in the process of selecting who their representatives are and not the other way around, not elected officials trying to decide who has the ability and the right to vote, making sure that women have the ability to make their own choices with their own bodies, making sure that we are creating a playing field where everybody has an equitable opportunity to be able to progress in life. Those are the core values of the Democratic Party and a large reason for why I myself am a Democrat. And I'll just just a little aside, as I was coming of age, I didn't want to fall into that same trap of, well, my parents are Democrats, so I'm supposed to be a Democrat. My parents are Christian, so I'm supposed to be a Christian. And so what I did, I looked at the platforms of both of the parties to try to decide which is right for me. And it was very clear for me after that which party I aligned with. As a black out gay man, there was no way in heck that I was ever going to be able to support and vote as a Republican. And that stands today. That's just not going to happen for me. So.
Okay, there you go. There you have it. The pitch for the Democratic Party. You raised good issues too. Dr. Perry, we talked about, and Randy did an excellent job of kind of level setting and helping us define what are the values and tenets of the Democrat Party. As it stands today, if you had to identify key characteristics of the Republican Party, what would those be?
Oh, gosh. Well, it depends on who you talk to in the Republican Party. So, you know, there's Trump, and then there's the Republican Party. And
Are they truly separate?
I would say that in some cases, yes, they are. I mean, in every private room where the mics are off, every Republican is over Donald Trump. But he has a life-size, just a huge impact on media presence, as you were saying. And so the media likes Donald Trump because Donald Trump helps their ratings. And so Donald Trump is still in the consciousness of Americans, even though he's not president, and has not even announced that he'd ever run for anything ever again, because of this perception that he is the Republican Party. And if you don't believe me, then you can call Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy, who are the two top leaders in Congress right now, the Republicans, and they have all capitulated in various ways to Donald Trump. You see them at Mar-a-Lago, brokering deals, and you see that when Donald Trump says that a certain candidate should be the candidate, that is what the party goes with. So in Georgia, for example, you have a likely GOP nominee for Senate who just moved to Georgia. But because Donald Trump, has argued that this person should be the candidate, even though they've never run for office before, like Donald Trump, and has zero experience whatsoever in serving the public, that is who the media and the party itself has run with, to show you the huge influence that Donald Trump has currently on the Republican Party. The reason, so I started with that because there's really kind of two versions of the Republican Party going on right now. You have the Trumpers who are legitimately pro-Donald Trump in every way, shape, and form all the time. And then you have people who are not. And either some of those have been never Trumpers, some of those have been, moderates who have aligned with Trump sometimes and not other times. The reason why that matters is because Republicans are going to have to figure out at some point who the standard bearer of the party is going to be. And it's clear that if it's going to be Donald Trump again, that's going to create a whole bunch of challenges for them, as we've seen with the census numbers, et cetera, where Americans are growing and the country is becoming much more brown and black than ever before, particularly in southern states. And if those young people who are 18 and older now actually do turn out and vote, they are expected to vote on the left side of the spectrum, and so that will hurt Republicans, which is why you see every single Republican-led legislature now doing what they can in redistricting to ensure that that they can pick who their constituents will be versus the constituents being able to pick themselves. And so, in general, the Republican Party is supposed to stand for limited government involvement in one's private life. So it's supposed to stand for absolute religious freedom and for economic version of economic capitalism that argues that every single person ought to be able to have an equal opportunity to achieve. That's what's all around this building as it relates to former Senator Bob Dole's career. But that era of republicanism is over. And we really just simply don't have it. With the death of John McCain as well, there's no standard bearer for that, what used to be a gang of seven, or those moderate Republicans that could make Congress function throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, as many of us remember it. That group no longer exists, and so Republicans, generally, they do still, even the Trumpers, support what they consider to be limited government. And I always quibble with this because we're in the Midwest and it's Tornado Alley here, and everyone is, in many ways, doesn't want the government involved in your life. And there's two challenges for Republicans. One came with same gender loving marriage. As an openly gay man myself, the challenge for Republicans then was that was an example of not involving the government in one's private life. And yet here the Republican Party was, doing just that, and ironically on a religious issue, on claims of religious identity, which they also have historically argued aggressively for religious freedom over the course of their party's history. And so you have this clear challenge that Republicans are wrestling with in terms of their own core values and their own core identities. And the sexuality question has made that a huge challenge for them. And the issue with limited government, in that everyone has a challenge with limited government, perhaps if you're a conservative, except when it comes to a tornado or a hurricane. And the first thing you call is, where's the government? And so I think we don't recognize how much we all need government and how much we all rely on government for our everyday engagements. And if government were to disappear or go away or become so-called less involved in one's life, you're essentially then allowing the private sector, what Republicans consider the market, to run what your life chances may become. And as a black person, as a gay person, whenever you have tried to gain rights as a minority group in this country, it has only come at the macro level, at the national level, for minorities as a result at the hands of the federal government. It's the only thing that's ever happened. I mentioned the Little Rock crisis, It's federal government. And I can keep naming dozens of other examples. Voting Rights Act, federal government, Civil Rights Act, which gave women, for example, the right to participate in sports, which was a joke of a sexist senator that he thought that would derail the Civil Rights Act by throwing that in there. And obviously, lo and behold, it passed. And so the Republican Party has challenges now because of that long history of being anti-marginalized groups in the modern American mid-20th century history. And that's what people remember. And so the challenge for them is going to be to figure out whether or not they really are for limited government, and what does that mean? And it can't just mean, limited spending, because again, which party actually has increased the deficit the most? In the last 30 years, the Republican Party. Which party has added to the federal government in terms of branches of departments? Republican Party, added the Department of Homeland Security, for example. So, the idea that, they're against government expansion and against and are for limited government has really run up against kind of contemporary times for them, and they haven't found a way to figure that out yet. And that's largely why I think the Republican Party is having a lot of challenges in areas where they historically have not had challenges. And we find Democrats and independents wedging their way in and winning in a lot of these so-called battleground areas, like here in the heartland of America in the Midwest.
Where Sharice Davids was able to flip her district to become the House of Representatives member that is in Congress today. But I would argue that Democrats have similar challenges, but for different reasons. When you look at the wide spectrum of the Democratic Party and where candidates run and how local issues may impact how a candidate and what values the candidate runs on, I think of John Ossoff in Georgia who ran, but if I'm not mistaken, and Anoa, you correct me, being from Georgia, you probably have a better sense, but wasn't, quote unquote, right on issues of reproductive justice and other core issues of the, go ahead, Anoa.
When he ran in the 2017 special election, the John Ossoff we now have in Senate is a John Ossoff who definitely learned the lessons of his special election in 2017. He listened and was very, very lucky to have Senator Reverend, that's so wild to say, Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, who used to be the board chair of the New Georgia Project. So got to meet the senator on several occasions, but folks really thought that, it's John Ossoff, but having the Reverend kind of being on the same ticket as him really helped a lot in terms of getting that engagement, that energy, and, you know, Senator Ossoff leaned in and listened, and he learned because he really wanted to win. And you know, everyone in Georgia pulling off what folks thought was impossible to flip one, not let alone 2 seats, was an amazing thing that everybody was very motivated to do. So, you know, there were a lot of hard conversations that I know organizers on the ground had with Senator Ossoff for him to be the advocate that he's becoming in the Senate now.
But would it raise, go ahead.
Even in his election pre the runoff, political scientists have done analysis that show that his outreach to the African American community in Georgia during the election was far less than it was during the runoff with Raphael Warnock. And so that demonstrates that he listened, and he treated the runoff as a different campaign than the whole prior Senate campaign he'd run. And had he not done that, he wouldn't be where he is.
Well, I mean, when those numbers came in too, right? When those numbers came in and you really saw the gains in particular areas. I mean, folks also, again, undervalued Senator Warnock because they didn't think that he had the same appeal, the same numbers. He didn't have the same fundraising. But when the numbers came in, he was pulling more, you know, percentage-wise overall, or just raw numbers than Senator Ossoff did. And he had that big, what we call in Georgia, I don't know if y'all have them here, jungle primaries. So if there's like an open seat, like if it's an open seat, so everybody from all the parties are all running on one ticket for one seat, it's the wildest thing ever. I don't know why it's allowed to happen, but you know, Senator Warnock was pulling very strong, even with Kelly Loeffler, who was the acting senator or the former senator in that seat. Whereas, you know, it was very, very tight between former Senator Perdue and, you know, John Ossoff at the time. It was very, very tight, and folks were like, I didn't think it was going to be that close. And all of us were sitting around like, we did. We could have told y'all it's going to be this way. But that outreach, like you said, was very real. I mean, also rural engagement, right? People think rural is a particular type of way, but, you know, we all know from our own experiences that, you know, getting out and talking to people in rural communities and listening to those issues and having those conversations is just as important in talking to the soccer moms or whoever else that you're trying to engage, because that is a huge, often untapped group of voters that have very real issues that are worth listening to. And, you know, there might be a small town here or a small county here, but them numbers add up when you're running statewide.
All the numbers add up.
All the numbers add up.
Be able to count your votes, and we'll know where your voters are, if anybody running for office. But you raise a point that I want to dive into a little bit. Sometimes the standard bearer could be the very face and the embodiment of what a political party's values or political ideology stands for. I think of, you know, what you just mentioned, how Senator Ralph Warnock was able to pull in Democratic voters because of who he was and what he stood for. When we think about other standard bearers, like you mentioned, Dr. Perry, former President Trump, I think of Bernie Sanders. And when you hear Bernie Sanders, you think progressive. When you think Joe Biden, I would imagine you might think Democrat, moderate Democrat. What role do these standard bearers play in shaping the values of a party, and how do they impact how voters decide what they'll vote for, the turnout? How do they impact both campaigns and government? And I'm hoping that both you and Randy can speak to this.
I'll keep it short so we can get to Randy, because I'm definitely interested in what he has to say. But I think that standard bearers play a very important role in helping to be that messenger and really engaging with people and helping people understand what the values are, what the purpose and mission is. And if we're talking about like a party leadership type of position, whether it's a senior, like a standard bearer on the state level or nationally, what the platform is and how it relates to people's lives, right? Like Randy said earlier, I think it was, you know, President Joe Biden's, the way he ran is way more liberal than what his record has been over several decades in Congress. And not saying that he's been super conservative all the time on everything. He's had some very, you know, moments, but it was, I mean, the Build Back Better agenda right now is far more visionary than I think most people imagine would come from a Biden presidency. Yeah. So it's very important. I think it's also important that those individuals have key people around them who are experts in their various fields, because you can't know everything. You can't do everything. So you have to have strong advisors and other people around you who know how to connect with the right people people to actually bring people in and be a uniter instead of a divider.
Discussed earlier, 1/3 of the electorate are independents. And so even though we are the Democratic Party, we're going to, of course, reach out to our core voters, but we've got to find a way to be able to reach out to those independents and to those Republicans that are persuadable. And so that means that we have to find the right messengers for those people. Not that we change our message, but we find the right messengers that those people will listen to, and we find the right way to message to them. There have been some studies that have been done that show when you have progressive and or liberal policies, but they're described in more conservative terms, that people who identify as more conservative will then come along with those policies. And so we've got to find the way to appropriately message to those individuals and find the right people to message to them. And that is something, I think, a critique of the Democratic Party we have not always done as well as we could have. And then to go back to a point, we've got to make sure that we're reaching out to those voters all over the state. There are a lot of people of color that are in rural. Speaking of Missouri, there are several towns in Missouri that have 40% population of Hispanic folk, Milan, a lot of these smaller towns that people don't think about. And they're, like you said, numbers add up. And because it may be a small town of 1,500, people don't think to go there. But when you have 50 towns across the state with those populations, again, those numbers add up. But more importantly, those people matter. And so we have to make sure that we are getting putting people into office that are going to be able to have a positive impact on the lives of the people. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's really all about. It's not about party. It's not about identity. It's about making a change in people's lives. And if we are not getting our message out and making sure people know who we are and what we stand for and how those values are going to change their lives, then what we're doing is for naught.
Yeah.
So, if I may,
Go ahead.
I wanted to add one comment about standard bearers that I don't think we discussed, is that sometimes standard bearers can create negative outcomes and relationships in politics. And so let's think of someone like Hillary Clinton, for example. I think we're still learning the lessons from 2016. And I don't think we've learned those lessons yet. And a very obviously sexist, Russia-influenced campaign. And there was a huge effort in 2016 to miseducate African Americans and young people on the record of Hillary Clinton. And at that time, that was the most progressive Democratic Party platform ever. But that wasn't what you heard in several minority circles. Yes. I can't tell you as a black man how many black barbershops I went to where I had to walk out of them. And because, what I'm getting at is because the standard bearer can, for a right of no fault of their own, be perceived in a certain way that creates disillusionment and detachment from the political system for their would-be voters. But also the standard bearer, obviously, you can think about it in the context of Donald Trump, can also be so polarizing that people are turned off to them because of, not necessarily you think that they are, negative in some way, like Hillary Clinton had high negatives in terms of how people viewed her. Trump was a little bit better, but that was also based on, this idea that this standard bearer somewhat becomes. And so I think
And Dr. Perry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to dive into that a little bit more. Is it truly through no fault of their own? I think that when you look at standard bearers and the work that they have to go through to attract the voters and their base, there's a lot of monetary resources and time and effort put towards developing, whether it be the relationships or creating the perception and the brand, for lack of a better word, that a candidate or a standard bearer may have. When we think about Hillary Clinton or even Senator Sanders or even Donald Trump and how they approach their base, the resources that they spent to talk to their bases and to make sure that their messages resonated, you could see a difference between those three candidates. So is it truly through no fault of their own, or is it up to whether it be operatives or their infrastructure, their campaign infrastructure or governmental infrastructure to sell voters on their issues and their brand. There was a report that came out recently that said that polling found that most Americans were familiar with the Build Back Better plan, but didn't know what was in it. Is that, a function of the administration? I'm only asking to critique or for the information, but is that a function of the administration? Maybe not doing the outreach that they need to do to communicate that. Trump was very successful at continuing to engage his base and continued to have pretty high approval ratings amongst his base, even at his worst, for most of us who would view him that way.
So I would say that in terms of the standard bearer, some things can be attached to the standard bearer that I do think is unfair. For example, we attach the concept of moderate, the ideology of moderate, to Joe Biden. Joe Biden has never said he's a moderate. We think of him that way, right? And so, when now the standard bearer of the Democratic Party is viewed as a moderate, even though they themselves don't call themselves that can hugely impact whether or not you engage with that party and with that individual. And because if you don't agree with the way the media perhaps has portrayed the standard bearer, then you may not therefore even engage with that standard bearer. And I think that cuts both ways for all parties. I do think that I'm one of the weird political scientists that believes when the Constitution and the early documents were written, where we said a lot the phrase "by the people." And what I'm getting at here is that I don't believe it's a political party's job to convince citizens to vote. I don't think that's their job. A political party's job is to win elections. That's their job. That's why they exist. The job is not actually to convince citizens of their own rights to take advantage of them to cast ballots and vote. I disagree with that. I don't think it's a part. I think it has become the perception that that's the party's responsibility. But ultimately, if you believe in our democratic republic, then you also have to believe in the citizen rights that come along with that were very hard fought, by the way. Dred Scott did not have rights in 1857, but he did 11 years later, in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, where we granted citizenship to African Americans. So citizenship is a real concept. And I think the challenge is Americans, one, in our public education system, we don't really teach civics anymore. It's not mandated. So we have generations of students who don't know that there's 3 branches of government, and they're in college, or older than that. And that's a huge challenge. But I think the concept that I, as a citizen, need to hear from a party to get me out the door, to care about to exercise my own interests and my own values, I actually don't think that's the party's job. It's my responsibility actually to seek them out, to search for the candidates, to do like you did, to look at the party platforms. Those are citizens' responsibilities. And if you don't like what the party is doing, either party, then I don't think the solution is to just criticize them publicly, but to also join in the effort, make it better. Exactly. And I don't think I see enough of that on either side of the aisle. We see a lot of criticism of the party about what they aren't doing. And I argue with my students all the time, they is you. There is no us and them. The government is not them. They aren't the people in your city council. They're not the people on your state house. The government is you. It's us. It's we. And if we forget that, then it's easy for us to detach ourselves from the people who are our elected representatives. That's the point. Their job is to go there and represent our interests, but they can't do that if we don't tell them what those interests are.
And if we don't engage, so essentially if you oppose, propose, right? Like it's not enough to oppose if you don't have a proposal or do the work to jump in. So what is the role of the party? What is the party supposed to be doing then? And how does money and standard bearers, and what are some of the other external factors that impact the work of the party to be robust and to attract voters if it is not the party's duty to attract voters?
So I would disagree with that to some degree. And I think part of that is just because of how we are as a society now. So a big part of our responsibility now is getting people registered to vote, is getting people engaged into the process, and then also to remind them that their job doesn't end with just casting that ballot also, but it goes beyond that. And so that is a part of it. A part of it is, again, making sure that we are getting the message out there about the different candidates that are running on the Democratic platform, so the voters know who they are, what they stand for, what they're going to be getting when they vote for those people. So that is a big part of our job and function. And then there are a lot of other things that people have no idea that political parties have to deal with, from selecting who are going to be the representatives at the Democratic National Committee. That's a function of the state party. Being a part of the process of redistricting. That's a function of the state party. Selecting who are going to be members of state committee and those sorts of things, who, at least in Missouri, are a part of the folks who, when there is a vacancy in the state legislature, get to appoint who's going to be the person to represent the party as the nominee. So those are all functions of the state party as well. All of those things, as you said, take resources. And so a big part of our job also is to build and develop and maintain relationships with funders that will allow us to be able to carry out all of those activities that we have to do as a party as well.
I imagine that's become challenging with the creation of C4s and PACs, who can also raise money to support, whether it be direct issues or candidates that they want to see advance. How has that impacted the work of the party to build infrastructure to elect candidates and to move issues forward?
I think to some degree that has actually freed us up from having to do some of those things and allowed us to be able to partner with those sorts of C4s and nonprofit organizations where they can kind of take on those roles and we can partner with them and really focus on the things that we as the party are good at and need to do to engage with the voters, get the voters out there, help spread the message, and then working with those partners on those sorts of things. And so our role is shifting and changing, and as C4s are popping up, again, we're working to navigate and figure out how and where we fit within that space as well.
Mm-hmm. This has been a robust discussion. I didn't even get to drop the email to send questions, so I'll drop it now. If you're watching us virtually, you have questions, feel free to email us at dolequestions@ku.edu. I'm going to open the floor to questions, and then once we conclude with questions, I'll get some wrap-up remarks from each of you. But if there are any questions in the audience, feel free to raise your hand. We have the Student Advisory Board, which has been instrumental in ensuring that these discussions go well. And we have Will with the mic. Will's got the mic, and he'll bring it around if you have questions. Okay.
I'm in the camp that believes that you really, in the United States, to be successful, you need two strong political parties that can argue against each other, push against each other, negotiate with each other. I really think that's important. And as part of that, I think, the political parties, each one of them needs a strong platform so that people in the United States can really understand what the platform is. But in the last election, the Republican Party did not even develop a platform. So my question is, how sustainable is that if a party in the United States doesn't even have a platform to go with? And I say that as a registered Republican my whole life.
Well, I'll open it to whoever wants to take that question.
I would just say that I sadly think that it's very sustainable now. People don't read the party platforms. I, in many Democratic circles for the 2016 election where I was working, a lot of people I engaged with who consider themselves far left of center did not read the Democratic Party platform. And I could always prove that by asking them a question of whether or not Hillary supported this or Hillary supported that. And so I say that to say that people aren't reading anymore. And so because of that, I actually think that it's possible for a party to not have a platform because other than the stalwarts in the party who are actively engaged at the local or state level, who may go to the conventions and the committee meetings, et cetera, they of course know what the party platform is, but you can't put a 70-page party platform on a 3 bullet point note card that you mail to people. And so that's substantively, I think, the challenge. And we simply are not going to read a 70-page document. That's what it was in 2016 for Democrats. And to learn what the party positions are. I think that's unfortunate, but I think that's what the Trump campaign understood, which is why they knew that a party platform was not necessary, because they were smart enough to realize that Americans are very much centralized around television now, and poor radio and poor newspapers. I feel sorry for those industries. I like the radio and the newspapers. I still read anyway. And so I think, unfortunately, it is sustainable, and I think we're going to see more of that. And I would certainly expect it if Donald Trump is going to be the nominee again in 2024.
Anoa, I'd like for you to expound on that. Do you think that that's the case, and what is the role of media in providing access to information so that people could be more informed? Because I think Dr. Perry is right. Most people will not read a 70-page platform. If we think about what happened with former President Obama in passing the healthcare initiative they tried to pass, that bill was some 400 some odd pages and no one was reading that, but the Republicans were effective in creating this narrative around Joe the plumber and how that bill will impact Joe the plumber. And in making that narrative relatable to most people, I think that they were able to push a narrative that ran counter to what President Obama was doing, but was effective, essentially. And from where you sit, how important is a platform? And having worked for Senator Sanders, I don't know how many times I got asked about Bernie's platform and how we were going to pay for free college and how these things were going to happen from folks who you may not assume were highly versed in political platforms and ideologies. So, Anoa, could you expand on that a little more? What is the role of media? Are people not reading things? Are they not informed? Is that the case?
I definitely agree with that. I think there is a statistic that I think still holds true that only about 60% of people read headlines only and don't read past the headlines to the full story. I will just say, in response to your question, though, briefly about sustainability, I agree with Dr. Perry that I do think that, unfortunately, we are living in an ecosystem now where all types of shenanigans might be sustainable for a period of time. But I do think that if there are real concerns or considerations that you and other select individuals, maybe in civic groups and stuff, what does it look like to be more self-motivated in developing an agenda or platform for issues that matter, at least in terms of like the local political system that you're in? That's something to consider as well. If national interests aren't meeting what needs to be done at the local, county, state level, or whatever the case may be. To your question about the media, it's really interesting, right? Because you see Rachel Maddow, or you see, I don't know, My Dad Loves Mehdi Hasan. You see whoever on CNN or Fox News, whatever you're watching. Everyone's acting like they're the ones that are delivering the real deal. They're fighting the good fight. They're telling you the truth. But there's so much that is left out and not being given to us. I do see media, and I write for a Black digital news outlet called News One, but I also contribute to several others. I do feel like there is still so much focus industry-wise, because we still live in a capitalist society, on clicks and ad revenue and things of that nature, so it's what is driving. And unfortunately, real meaty, even if they're relevant policy stories, don't get the same engagement as whomever viral whatever nonsense is happening. And so I do think we do need to find a way to cut through the noise and communicate with people about what the issues are and how they matter. And maybe we do need to find a smart way. Maybe there's a way that one of y'all will develop someday, I don't know, where you can get that 70 pages down to a one-pager. And I don't even know if people are reading one-pagers anymore, which is sad. But I mean, maybe somebody can put it on TikTok, because I know if it's on TikTok or Instagram,
put a little dance with it and
let's put it to get a Squid Games little roll of it or something like that. Like, there is a way, I think, to engage people more on some of these issues. I just think that we have to be more willing to embrace the creative elements and maybe engage more younger people in helping us figure out how to do that. Because I know I don't know much about TikTok, except for the ones my kids send me. But I do know that that is where, I asked my son, I was like, where are you, because he came in about some news story. I was like, why do you know about that? He was like, oh, I saw it on TikTok. And I was like, oh. So there is a way I think we can engage and break through and help people understand the importance. Because I think there's also a lost value, right? I don't think people understand the value of why we need such things as policy documents or platforms or things of that nature, right? But they're real grounding foundational documents. Like, I mean, we still rely on the Constitution, and it's over 200 years old, right? So those foundational documents, those frameworks are still very important. And I think we need to reinforce that and just figure out how to connect those things. In terms of media, there are those in media, though, who are trying. So supporting, you know, whether it's your favorite journalist or outlet or whatever that are putting out good content, sharing good information. We didn't even get to touch on disinformation, but making sure we're getting good information out there and that we're sharing with our folks about what's happening and engagement. That also helps, I think, getting people thinking a little bit more, because people, I think, do want to be informed, but folks are busy and often don't know where to look either.
Yep. And because politics, I think for most people, is so complex, convoluted, filled with jargon, catchphrases, or words that you may or may not be familiar with, that it could be, for some folks, intimidating. And again, when you're busy, you've got kids and a husband and a wife, or you're taking care of children, what have you, working, you may not have the bandwidth to suss through or assess which media outlets are giving you the right information, which information is good information, what's misinformation, what does the Democratic Party stand for. You open up a web page and it's a 70-page platform, right? Folks don't really have time for that. With that being said, I'll open the floor to questions. If you have questions, raise your hand. We'll take a couple questions, and I do want to close with a question in particular.
You mentioned the browning of America and how like now the Latino and African American communities are growing, but also those communities are not as monolithic as they used to be. And how do you think this like changing, because in 2020 Trump got a bigger, larger margin of Latino voter than in 2016. So how do you think this like they are growing, but how like can candidates and parties actually listen to those communities specifically and not like look at them as a whole group now that they're bigger?
I think that's a great question, because when you look at black voters in particular, they lean a little more conservative than we might give black voters credit for, and tend to adhere to conservative ideologies, whether it be, smaller government or issues around the LGBT community and rights for the LGBT community, or reproductive rights. But I think, and Dr. Perry, all three of you could speak to this, but because of the historical shifts and what the Republican Party stands for, it's hard for Republicans to attract black voters who would, or conservative party candidates to attract black voters who may align with some of those issues, but can't get over their platforms of race and inclusivity and the like.
So I think we're in Hispanic Heritage Month still. I think it's important to acknowledge that community. The new census data that came out showed that the Latino Hispanic community are having kids at a far faster rate than anybody else. And those kids are becoming adults, and those adults we want to get locked into the political system so they can participate. We've done a horrible job as a country and as a political system, and understanding the demarcations of ethnic identity, significance, and difference between various Latino groups. There's over 20 in America. We predominantly are Mexican, Dominican, and Puerto Rican, but there are several other groups, and we basically pay them little to no attention, and they do think differently. For example, we know that Mexican Americans tend to lean Democratic. We know that Cuban Americans tend to lean Republican. And there's a whole bunch of differences in between. I don't know how parties do a better job at speaking to those specific communities, because like you were saying, Randy, it takes resources. And you can't go everywhere and you can't be everywhere. But I do think we have to find a much better way to engage and recognize that people are different within their own racial and ethnic categories, and they may or may not speak the same language, even though language sometimes is an opportunity to create cross communication. But we've done a bad job in terms of politics. Politicians have done a bad job. But in general, I think Americans have done a bad job of actually understanding race and ethnicity. And if you don't believe me, Google critical race theory, and you will probably find out that we've had a very rough history with this. I think one way to fix this is what's happening now across the country is with California just did it, made ethnic studies a statewide requirement. So every high school student will have to take an ethnic studies class. Same thing in Connecticut, same thing in Oregon. It was tried here in Kansas, it failed. And was tried in Texas and failed, but tried in Indiana and was successful. So it's not necessarily something that only liberal or conservative states support, but I think that's one way, because ultimately, if you don't know who these people are, because you never studied them, then it's impossible politically to represent their interests.
Or you never talk to them. I mean, just to follow up, thank you so much for the question. One thing that was really interesting was just thinking about folks I know who were organizing in Florida around the election and who were upset with the Biden campaign in particular for not understanding the difference between Cuban Americans in the Miami area and the influx of Puerto Ricans from the island in like the Orlando area, for example, right? Like there's a vast difference in ideology, experience, you know, and just the way people were engaging. And so what I would say is, one, yes, parties and like statewide operations need to do better, and there are tons of challenges to that. But I think even just in making the grassroots operatives more welcome to do some of that organizing, because some of the best organizing, regardless of what your political affiliation is, has been in language, in community, folks who actually know each other, bringing other people into the fold, right? We saw a lot of that in Georgia, which is how we were able to expand not just with, you know, Latino and Hispanic voters, as well as, you know, we saw a huge blossom of AAPI voters coming into the fold. And when you talk about, you know, a diverse community, having spoken to someone who did AAPI outreach, those are multiple different cultures, multiple different, you know, ethnicities, multiple different languages, all lumped under one umbrella. And it's such a vast continent that we're talking about, right? But one of the beautiful things was having people who were doing in-language community organizing, right? So if you're Korean, I'm organizing in Korean American communities or Korean immigrant communities, and I can talk to people. State Representative B. Win, who's one of our candidates in Georgia for Secretary of State, she's Vietnamese American, she's first generation Vietnamese American, and she talked about how important it was for her to go door knocking with her sister to be able to help someone who ended up being a first-time voter. They had been a citizen for I don't know how many years, but they didn't speak English very well. But having her come to the door to speak Vietnamese to them, to answer their questions, they were now excited to engage in the process. So that language barrier, because I don't think a lot of people realize we have citizens who aren't necessarily fluent or very fluent or comfortable. Even if they are fluent, they're not as comfortable conversing in English, right? So that doesn't make them less American than the rest of us. That just means that we need to engage them differently and make sure that they have the resources to participate as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I just add real quick? I think, again, this is a really important question. As has been said, none of these groups are a monolith. African Americans, Latinos, AAPI communities, LGBTQ plus community are not monoliths. And so we have to, as a party, one, we have to come to a reckoning that it's not a one-size-fits-all for these different communities. And then also, again, we have to make sure that we are authentically engaging in those communities and not just swooping in 2 weeks before the election and saying, hey, we did outreach to these communities. We have to really build those relationships, and that's going to take time. We have to understand the experiences that people from these different communities have had and how they view government is different for different communities. And we have to be very clear and understand that and approach those communities in a different way and not look at them as a commodity, but really look at them as people, because I think that is something that has not always been done, you know, when it comes to politics and elections. Again, you know, communities, they, you know, go to the black church and wave 2 weeks before, but they have not done the real work to get in and understand and learn the issues that are unique to each of those different communities. And that's something that, for me, is important as the executive director of the Missouri Democratic Party, that we engage in those ways. right now we're going through the process of updating our website. And so, we were having conversations of making sure that, our website is available in Spanish. But then I was like, and not only that, but then we have to make sure that we've got somebody who can continue and update that over time. So when we add new things, that those things are also translated. And so it's those little things, they seem little, but they make a very big difference in how people will engage in the electoral process.
And their engagement is important because once these public servants get elected, they are then better positioned to serve the communities that put them in office.
Absolutely.
Yes. I think we have one more question. Do we have one more question? And then we'll wrap up.
American politics is centered around competition between the Democrats and the Republicans. And so my question was, are there any regions or in particular states that you believe lean so far one way or another that competition between them for now and the foreseeable future is dead?
I would say no. So there are definitely, some states that are, people consider ruby red. People consider Missouri to be ruby red in a lot of instances, but it's really not that far back that we have to look that we had a majority, Democrats held a majority of the statewide offices. We had a majority in the state legislature.
That was prior to 2016, like not that far back, but
right,
we're talking like
not
4
that
years.
long ago at all.
You were alive for that.
At least in terms of
lifetime.
in terms of having the majority of the statewide offices.
Yes.
Now the legislature, that's a different story in terms of the numbers there. But again, I think a lot of it goes back to just the perception. People have a perception that, oh, I'm in a red state, so my vote doesn't matter. And so oftentimes what we see is then people don't engage, and or those that are seeking office will not engage in certain communities because they assume that those people are not going to come out and vote for them. People want to be courted, and if you go out there and court and engage people, they will respond. That doesn't mean you may win right away, but you begin to chip away at that. And so I never think that any place is too far gone for any one of the parties to be able to come back.
I think that on some level, if I can add to that, that there are some states in parts of the country where they have maybe been red or blue longer than they have been any, identified as one of the other parties. I don't know that California will become red or, heavily Republican here anytime soon, for instance, or New York. But I do agree with Randy wholeheartedly that not only should you not count any state or region or population out, but there are a lot of factors that contribute to why a state may flip or why a state may change or why it may stay with one political party or the other. If you look at Missouri, Missouri had for a long time been identified as purple, a bellwether state. And if you look at what happened in 2020 in the elections, a number of states that had traditionally been red, i.e. Georgia, flipped for President Joe Biden. And so I think that there are a number of factors that play into that: population change, redistricting, laws that prevent or encourage voting and participation in our democratic processes. There are a lot of things that play into that, but typically and historically, you tend to see shifts in tenure waves. Kansas experienced that shift. I would think it was in 08 or 09. Kansas at one point was very much like Missouri in that a lot of the statewide offices and the legislature was leaning or heavily Democrat, and then shifted with the election of Sam Brown back for governor. And you're starting to see that shift come back the other way. We have Governor Laura Kelly in office, and you're starting to see a few more moderate Democrats rise up and take office. So I think it depends on not only the historical nature of a state, but a lot of other factors: redistricting, laws, population. All of that plays into whether a state is in play or not.
Just would add real quickly too, when you look at the maps I like the most are the ones that are like the speckle maps of red and blue. So you see all the different pockets and areas, not just how like a state is solidly one color. Like no state is solidly one color or another, or even purple, right? When you actually look at how it's broken down into like the different districts and things of that nature, it's more like a splatter map type of situation. And so you do have very strong pockets of everything everywhere, even in a California or in New York. And so I do think that a lot of folks are starting to see that there is the possibility that maybe even if we can only flip our local city council, that's still a major win, and starting to really reflect on the importance and value of that local level participation, because when we get more people engaged at that local level and who start to understand that the state level is also important, then we're not just always so focused on Congress and the presidency. And I think so some of the shifts we're seeing happening either direction, I think is because we're starting to see people really taking the state and local more important, and just recognizing that there's always, I don't know, I'm an optimist, so there's always hope.
Yeah,
well, and the state and local races is what builds the infrastructure for what happens at the congressional level. And we tend to forget that. Republicans did not forget that at the election of former President Obama, and they made it their business to take over state legislatures, to see the number of state legislatures that flipped from whether, either close on the margin to red and supermajority Republican was astronomical, and that was by intention. The number of local city council and mayoral seats that they took. School boards was astronomical, and those seats tend to be the kind of gateway into higher levels of political office, which then creates the bench that allows Republicans to take over at the congressional level. And those local seats have a lot of sway in the decisions that impact a candidate's ability to run and win, whether it be through the census, that impacts how many electoral votes you get during a presidential campaign, how many people are in a population, to redistricting, as Randy mentioned. That's decided by folks at the local and state levels within the party infrastructure. So pay attention to what's going on locally at the state level, because that impacts what happens at the congressional and national levels.
And those have a more direct impact on our day-to-day lives as well.
Yes.
I appreciate the question as well, because I think it's also maybe a reflection of, again, what we see in the media.
Yes.
And it really has become the fourth branch of government. We used to say it was the bureaucracy. It's probably the media now. And that is, the challenge then is that all the things that we're suggesting has to occur in a national media context where things are still red and blue. There's a famous guy from 2004 that said, there's no red states or blue states, it's just the United States of America. And he said that in Boston, a state that, in Massachusetts, a state that I've lived in before, that American national media portrays as liberal and forgets that it's had 2 or 3 Republican governors in the past 10 years. Right. And I've lived in Virginia, for example, as Virginia has shifted from a so-called red state to now a reliably blue state. We'll see in a couple of weeks if that still is the case.
Yes, we will. That race is tight.
And I'm from Ohio, which is now a red state, but when I was a kid, it was pretty much a blue state, particularly in national elections. And so it is important to vote in your local and state elections. You have to know who your state rep and state senator is. You should particularly pay attention during the year of redistricting, which was the year that just passed, because those people will select the congressional lines, as was said, about that the media will then use to color things that are red or blue. And so, but it starts with you and me voting in local and state elections. It's really absolutely critical, and like as Randy was saying, it's what actually benefits you the most, meaning that you can complain about a pothole in your street, and then you can see tomorrow that pothole was filled. And it's actually really gratifying to participate in local and state politics, because then you genuinely see the impact that you have that somewhat is missed on the macro national level. And so the challenge, though, I think is still media and TV, because local and state politics is not on TV. And so unless you're watching your local news, which of course nobody is, sadly, according to Nielsen ratings and numbers. So it's very low ratings on local news stations. There might be a reason for that, because many of them are owned by a conservative media company that has put forth a certain agenda. But nonetheless, people don't know their local issues because they aren't reading newspapers, and if it's not covered on your national cable news, then you aren't watching it. And what we find now is that most people turn on local news for the weather, not for the news. And that actually becomes a real challenge. And so as an urbanist, urban politics is my first love. Surely the best way to impact your own interests is to vote in local and state elections. Every single election. Like when I lived in Virginia, there's an election every year. And so we can't just vote just every 4 years in the presidential election. There's some years you might vote 3-4 times, depending on where you may live.
But the key is to vote in every single election, no matter whether you're a Republican, Democrat, progressive, independent, conservative, make sure you vote and participate. If you could all be so kind as to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. Randy Dunn, Executive Director of the Missouri Democratic Party, Dr. Ravi Perry, and representative from the fourth arm of government media, Anoa Changa, writer and activist. Thank you all for joining us. We'd like to thank the Dole Institute and the Student Advisory Board for all of their work to make this discussion possible. Want to thank Newman's Own for their generous donation to the Dole Institute in this discussion series. This discussion was made possible because of Newman's Own. If you want to learn more about Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, you can visit the website at www.shirleyskitchencabinet.org. We're going to be here next week. I don't know if you all know this, but I'm here again next week. Same time, same place. You can come late and you can even leave early, but just make sure you don't miss out. So thank you all for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next week.